Hello, my name is Gary, and I was raised in the Western United States, so I'm a native English speaker. I hope that you will enjoy this YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us.
The Tale of Henrietta Hen by Arthur Scott Bailey, 1877 to 1949. Chapter 1. A Speckled Beauty. Henrietta Hen thought very highly of herself. She often called herself a speckled beauty and had a high opinion of her habits, ideas, and even her belongings. Whenever she dug up a fat worm or grub, she did it with a proud flourish and would almost always say, "Let's see anyone else find a bigger one than this." Of course, she wouldn't have been happy at all if one of her neighbors actually outdid her. That was just her way of boasting that no one could beat her. If anyone mentioned speckles, Henrietta would immediately talk about hers, claiming they were the most striking in all of Pleasant Valley. And if the topic shifted to combs, she'd proudly declare that hers was the reddest and most beautiful in the world. No one knew how she came to these conclusions, considering she had never left the farm. But pointing that out only made her angry. With such a high opinion of herself, Henrietta always had plenty to say. She clucked non-stop from sunrise to sunset, whether she was alone or with company. Naturally, she preferred having an audience because she believed her words were very important. Henrietta went out of her way to make sure her neighbors heard her, especially when she had a new egg to show off. A simple cluck wasn't enough to express her excitement. Instead, she would belt out a loud, high-pitched cut, 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 and repeat it several times so everyone would know she had laid another one of her famous eggs. Afterward, she would go around asking if people had heard the news, as if they could have missed her noise. Sometimes, though, her boasting didn't go as planned. Her question, "Have you heard the news?" often brought teasing responses like, "Polly Plymouth Rock just laid a huge egg. Have you seen it?" Or, "Don't worry, Henrietta. Someone has to lay the smallest ones." These comments always made Henrietta lose her temper. She'd rant loudly about her jealous neighbors and complain about how hard it was to live among people who couldn't appreciate the finest eggs ever laid. On such occasions, she often talked about moving to the village. "They know how good my eggs are down there," she'd boast. "Boiled, fried, poached, scrambled, or in an omelet, my eggs are unbeatable." Polly Plymouth Rock joked, "If they can't beat your eggs, they can't make an omelet." For once, Henrietta had no response. It was one of the rare times she was completely speechless. Chapter 2. A Fine Family. Henrietta Hen's neighbors barely paid attention to her constant bragging anymore. It happened so often that they had grown used to it. But one day she started cackling louder than ever before, shouting, "Come see what I've got! Come see what I've got!" over and over at the top of her voice. She was acting so overly proud that her neighbors couldn't help but wonder what she was making such a big deal about. "If it's just another egg, she's causing way too much fuss," they muttered to each other. Eventually, they decided they'd never get any peace unless they went to see what Henrietta was squawking about. Together, they made their way to her nest in the hayloft. As soon as Henrietta saw them coming, she got even louder. "Well, what's all the commotion about?" asked the oldest hen, a sharp-tongued, white-feathered dame. Henrietta stepped aside from her nest, puffed up with pride, and announced, "Have you ever seen such a fine family?" The others leaned in to look, and one hen said, "Oh, a brood of chicks, huh? What's with all the noise?" Ignoring her, Henrietta turned to the rest of the group and declared, "I knew you'd all want to see these prize-winning youngsters. You'll have to agree they're the best-looking chicks anyone's ever seen." The neighbors crowded around to see the fluffy little chicks. "This is your first brood, isn't it?" Polly Plymouth Rock asked. Henrietta nodded proudly. Wanting to be polite, the others complimented her chicks, saying they were lovely. But the old white hen, squinting at the nest, said, "They're fine, but one of them looks a little odd." The others quickly tried to hush her. They didn't want to upset Henrietta, especially since it was her first time hatching chicks. To distract her, they clucked their approval loudly, hoping she wouldn't hear the comment. Luckily, Henrietta was too thrilled with her new family to notice. "I hope you'll all visit often," she said. "As they grow, I'm sure they'll get even more handsome." The neighbors thanked her, and as they left, they surrounded old Whitey, trying to keep her from causing more trouble. Still, Whitey couldn't resist muttering, "What a vain, clueless bird Henrietta is. She doesn't even realize one of those chicks is actually a duckling." Chapter 3. Wet Feet. Henrietta Hen never realized that one of her chicks was different from the others. They were her first brood, and to her, every single one was perfect. As soon as Henrietta started taking her little ones on walks around the farmyard, she began teaching them important lessons. She showed them how to scratch in the dirt to find food, how to drink by tilting their heads back to let the water trickle down, and how to stay on the lookout for hawks, and even the sneaky Miss Kitty Cat. Above all, she constantly warned them to keep their feet dry. "Water is good for drinking, and that's it," Henrietta would tell her chicks. "Some odd creatures, like old Spot the dog, jump right into it. I'll never understand how they stay healthy. Dust baths are the only safe ones." Henrietta was so cautious about water that she wouldn't even let her chicks walk on damp grass until the morning dew had dried. At the first sign of rain, she would rush for shelter, calling for her chicks to follow her immediately. But there was always one chick who lagged behind whenever the rain started. He was especially drawn to puddles, and Henrietta often had to shoo him away. She would sigh and grumble that he caused her more trouble than all the other chicks put together. Her neighbors noticed this little oddball and whispered that he wasn't like the rest of her brood, but Henrietta simply thought he was unusually difficult to manage. As the chicks grew, Henrietta began taking them on longer walks, always keeping a watchful eye on the sky for hawks. Although no hawk ever attacked, one day something happened that scared Henrietta almost as much. She and her chicks wandered near the duck pond, stopping to scratch for food or fluff around in dusty patches. When they reached the edge of the pond, Henrietta immediately regretted bringing them there. The one troublesome chick, the one who didn't mind rain, started waddling toward the water's edge. "Get back here right now," Henrietta squawked, panicked. "You'll get your feet wet." No sooner had she said this than the chick leapt into the water, or rather onto it, as he floated effortlessly on the surface. He paddled around as though he had been swimming his whole life. Come back," Henrietta shrieked. "You'll drown, and your feet will get wet." Chapter 4. A Swimmer. Henrietta Hen sprinted down the bank as fast as she could, stopping just short of the water's edge. Flapping her wings and cackling loudly, she tried to get as close as she dared without risking wet feet. Meanwhile, her wayward chick, happily paddling around the duck pond, paid no attention to her frantic cries. Not only did he seem entirely unbothered by the water, but he actually looked like he enjoyed it. "What do I do? Oh, what do I do?" Henrietta squawked, her voice ringing across the yard. Her commotion soon drew the attention of her neighbors, who hurried over to see what all the fuss was about. As soon as they saw the scene, they burst into laughter. "Henrietta," one of them finally managed to say between giggles, "that chick of yours isn't a chick, it's a duckling. Water won't hurt him." Henrietta gasped, her beak opening and closing in astonishment. But it didn't take long for her to recover. True to her nature, she quickly turned the situation into an opportunity to brag. "Just look at him," she declared, puffing out her chest and gesturing proudly toward the duckling in the water. "Not one of you has a child that can swim like mine." "I should hope not," Polly Plymouth Rock retorted with a shrug of her polished feathers. The other hens murmured their agreement, all clearly relieved to have no swimmers in their families. "Well, I feel sorry for you," Henrietta replied smugly. "Every brood should have at least one swimmer. It adds variety." She strutted back and forth along the water's edge, clucking boastfully. In all her life, Henrietta had never felt quite as important, not even when her first chicks had cracked their way out of their shells. "Swimming is such an elegant skill," she added with a smug smile. "If it weren't for getting my feet wet, I'd be tempted to learn myself. I'm sure my son could teach me." "Your son?" Old Whitey sniffed disdainfully. "That's not your son, Henrietta. Someone must have played a trick on you and slipped a duck's egg into your nest, and I think I know who did it." For a moment, Henrietta stood frozen, her beak slightly open in disbelief. Her comb quivered as she scanned the faces of her companions, searching for even one that seemed doubtful, but no one disagreed with old Whitey. "Well," Henrietta muttered at last, her voice shaky, "it's strange no one mentioned it before. How could I have missed it?" "You've known from the start," Polly Plymouth Rock said bluntly. "You were the only one who didn't notice he was different." By now the duckling was happily paddling further and further away, seemingly unaware of the drama unfolding on shore. Henrietta watched him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She knew that no amount of cackling would bring him back. Finally, she gathered her remaining chicks around her, the ones she now thought of as her real children. "Let's go home," she said briskly. "What about him?" one of the chicks asked, nodding toward the duckling, who was still bobbing on the pond. "Aren't you going to bring him with us?" "No," Henrietta replied with a shrug. "We're better off without him. He's been more trouble than the rest of you put together. To be honest, I never liked him much anyway." Chapter 5. Caught by Mr. Crow. The cornfield wasn't far from the farmyard fence, and Henrietta Hen quickly discovered that the freshly plowed and harrowed field was an excellent place to scratch for worms, bugs, and grubs of all kinds. Henrietta wasn't exactly what you'd call a wise bird, unlike old Mr. Crow, so she had no idea Farmer Green had carefully planted corn in neat rows there. She did declare herself lucky whenever she happened to dig up a few kernels of corn, but she wasn't searching for corn specifically. She simply ate it when she stumbled upon it. It was no wonder, then, that she was startled when a hoarse voice suddenly called out, almost right in her ear, "You're a thief, and you can't deny it." Henrietta jumped. How could she not? The voice immediately said, "Aha! Only a guilty bird would jump like that." When Henrietta turned around, she found herself face to face with a stern-looking gentleman, his black, beady eyes fixed on her. "It takes me, Mr. Crow, to catch them," he croaked, "and I can spot a corn thief from half a mile away." Henrietta didn't say a word. At first, she was too surprised, and then she became too angry to respond. "Why don't you speak?" Mr. Crow demanded. He loved a good argument, but it wasn't nearly as fun if the other party stayed silent. Still, Henrietta refused to speak. Her silence puzzled Mr. Crow so much that he forgot his own anger, though it always upset him to see anyone but himself digging up corn. "What's wrong with you?" he asked. "Why won't you say something?" "I'm too proud to talk to you," Henrietta finally replied. "I wouldn't want to be seen speaking with the likes of you." "Ha!" Mr. Crow exclaimed. "You don't think I'm as good as you, do you?" "No," Henrietta said flatly. "I don't." Mr. Crow decided to argue his case. He launched into a long-winded speech about himself how many summers he had spent in Pleasant Valley, how far he could fly in a single day, and what an experienced traveler he was. The boasting went on and on. But Henrietta didn't look the least bit interested. In fact, she started scratching for worms again while he was still talking, which made Mr. Crow even angrier. "Don't you dare eat another kernel of corn," he thundered. "If you do, I'll tell Farmer Green." "Farmer Green feeds me corn every day, cracked corn," Henrietta replied with a shrug. "Well, I never," Mr. Crow squawked. "What's he thinking, wasting good corn like that?" "Really, I shouldn't even be seen talking to you," Henrietta said coolly. "If you have more questions, you can go ask the rooster in the barnyard. I'm sure he'll give you an answer you won't like." With that, she turned and walked away, her steps slow and dignified. Mr. Crow watched her go, his eyes gleaming with annoyance. He knew exactly what Henrietta meant. The rooster would be more than happy to fight him, and while Mr. Crow loved a good argument, he had no interest in anything more dangerous than a war of words. "I don't know what this farm is coming to," he muttered. "Farmer Green cracking corn for hens like her. Sometimes," he sighed, "I wish I were a speckled hen." Chapter 6. Henrietta Complains. There was another member of Farmer Green's flock, besides Henrietta Hen, who was quite proud. You didn't need to look twice at the rooster to know he thought very highly of himself. The way he strutted around the farmyard made it clear that he considered himself someone of great importance, and to be fair, most of the flock did follow his lead. Everyone simply referred to him as the rooster. Although there were younger, smaller roosters in the flock, he wouldn't allow anyone, at least in his presence, to call them anything but cockerels. These cockerels usually went out of their way to avoid him. If they weren't careful and he caught them off guard, he'd make life miserable for them. He had a way of making feathers fly. Now, Henrietta Hen thought the rooster was downright ridiculous. She often said it pained her to watch him strut around with his long, curved tail feathers bobbing as he walked. The truth was, Henrietta couldn't stand anyone looking more glamorous than her, and there was no denying the rooster's flashy appearance outshone everyone else's. His comb was larger than hers, and even had spurs on his legs. But what Henrietta Hen disliked most about the rooster was his crowing. It wasn't so much the sound of it, it was the timing. He always started his cock-a-doodle-doo while it was still dark, forcing everyone in the henhouse to wake up whether they wanted to or not. Henrietta wished he would at least wait until daylight. She often complained that it was completely absurd for someone of her fine upbringing to be roused at such an ungodly hour. She even claimed it was a miracle she managed to keep her good looks, considering the rooster's habit. "Why don't you ask him to wait until sunrise before he starts crowing?" Polly Plymouth Rock suggested to Henrietta one day. "I'll do just that," Henrietta declared. Without wasting a moment, she turned to a nearby cockerel. "Run over and ask the rooster," she began. But the cockerel cut her off. "Oh, I can't do that," he exclaimed. "I've never spoken to the rooster before. If I tried, he'd probably fight me." "Just tell him I sent you," Henrietta insisted. She made the cockerel listen to her request, but he wouldn't budge. He explained that the rooster would likely attack him as soon as he opened his beak. "Besides," the cockerel added, "it wouldn't make a difference. The rooster can't wait until after sunrise to crow." "Oh, he can't, can he?" Henrietta snapped. "I'd like to know the reason why." Fixing her stern gaze on the rooster, she marched across the farmyard to confront him herself. Chapter 7. Warning the Rooster. "Good afternoon," Henrietta Hen greeted the rooster cheerfully. He hadn't noticed her approaching, and when she spoke, he quickly adjusted his 2 long tail feathers into what he thought was a more elegant position. "Good afternoon, madam," he replied, always proud of his manners when addressing the ladies. But then, Catching the peculiar gleam in Henrietta's eye, he added cautiously, "Is something wrong?" "Yes, there is," she said firmly. The cockerels might have feared the rooster, but Henrietta certainly didn't. She thought he was a bit of a show-off and even believed she could take him in a fight if she ever stooped to such unladylike behavior. "Your crowing at the crack of dawn is a problem. You wake me up every single day with all that racket." The rooster fidgeted, clearly uncomfortable. "That's unfortunate," he stammered, then quickly tried to charm her. "But you don't look like you're losing sleep, madam. In fact, you seem more radiant every day." Henrietta Hen smirked. "True, but imagine how much better I'd look if I weren't disturbed so early. I hate getting up while it's still dark. So I'm asking you to hold off on your crowing until after sunrise." "Impossible," the rooster exclaimed. "I'm sorry, madam, but that's not something I can do." "That's exactly what the cockerels said," Henrietta replied. The rooster's feathers ruffled with irritation. "The cockerel? Which one? Has one of those little upstarts been gossiping about me? Point him out, and I'll teach him a lesson." Henrietta waved a wing dismissively. "I didn't notice which one it was. Honestly, they all look the same to me." "Fine," the rooster declared, puffing up his chest. "Then I'll deal with all of them, just to make sure the guilty one learns his place." "Don't be ridiculous," Henrietta said sharply. "I simply asked one of them to deliver a message, asking you not to crow so early. But he refused, saying it wouldn't make a difference." "It wouldn't have helped him anyway," the rooster said, stamping his foot and puffing out his chest to look brave in front of Henrietta Hen. Henrietta raised an eyebrow. "What's wrong? Did something you ate not agree with you?" The rooster looked a little embarrassed. Henrietta didn't respect him much and made sure he knew it. Taking advantage of his awkwardness, she quickly told him that from now on he needed to wait until after sunrise to crow. "I can't do that," he said, looking upset. "Don't even think about doing it early," Henrietta warned. "If you crow before sunrise, the rest will follow, and I won't get any rest at all." Chapter 8. Why the Rooster Crowed. Henrietta Hen had firmly instructed the rooster to wait until daylight before crowing. He could see she was determined to have her way, but he knew he couldn't comply. Still, he always made an effort to be polite to the ladies. "You don't understand," he blurted out. "I'd be happy to oblige you, but if I waited to crow until after the sun rose, I'd never crow again." "We could live with that," Henrietta Hen replied sharply. "Maybe you could," he admitted, in a tone that was unusually humble. "But could you handle it if the night never ended?" "That's ridiculous," she shot back. "You don't understand," he repeated. "And honestly, I'm surprised, madam, that you didn't know. It's me who wakes the sun up every morning. That's why I crow so early." Henrietta Hen was so stunned she couldn't find the words to respond. She stood there, thinking deeply, or as deeply as she could manage. "Haven't you noticed," the rooster pressed on, "that the sun doesn't rise until after I've crowed loudly several times over?" No, I haven't," she murmured, flustered. "But now that you mention it, I suppose that's true." "Exactly," he said, puffing up his chest. "Sometimes, madam, I have to crow for ages before the sun even peeks over Blue Mountain. Lucky for everyone, I have a strong, powerful voice," the rooster added with a smirk, feeling more confident. "If I had one of those thin, squeaky crows like those useless young cockerels, Farmer Green would have had to work in the dark plenty of times." "Goodness," Henrietta Hen gasped. "Please, Mr. Rooster, crow as loudly as you can the moment you wake up. Make as much noise as possible." He solemnly promised that he would. Henrietta walked away, but their conversation lingered in her mind. Then a troubling thought struck her. What if something happened to the rooster's voice? As soon as the question popped into her head, she rushed back to him. "Please be careful," she begged. "Don't get your feet wet. If you catch a cold, you might get so hoarse you couldn't crow louder than a whisper." The rooster thanked her kindly for her concern. "I always take care of myself," he assured her. "It looks like rain," she said worriedly, glancing at the sky. "Shouldn't you go into the barn?" He shook his head, dismissing the idea. "You ought to wear rain boots every day," she scolded him before leaving again. Soon she returned to suggest he carry an umbrella. Before long she came bustling back again to recommend he wrap a warm scarf around his neck. Her endless advice went on and on. At first the rooster found her fussing amusing, though he had no intention of following any of it. But after a while her constant hovering began to irritate him. "Good grief," he muttered. "Henrietta Hen is becoming a real nuisance."